Greetings to all chess lovers. Today we look at the brilliant game the first world champion Wilhelm Steinitz played in Vienna in 1860 against Reiner. In this game Steinitz played black, his opponent moved e4 and responded symmetrically. White develops his piece to the center and attacks the pawn. Black defends this pawn with his knight, also developing d4. This is a Scottish party. White immediately attacks the infantryman on the e5 square, so black exchanges on the d4 square. Well, the classic Scottish is just capturing on the d4 square with a knight. But Reiner uses the Scottish gambit against Steinitz. He sacrifices a pawn but at the same time tries to get a big advantage in development. His bishop on square c4, looking closely at the f7 point in the opponent's position. Steinitz defends the extra pawn by also developing a piece. White hides the king in a safe place. Black opens the way for the development of his light-squared bishop and takes control of the central square e5. With c3, White allows black to exchange on the c3 square and finally get an extra infantryman. But if black accepts this sacrifice, then after the move the knight c3 White will have a colossal advantage in development. The black king has not yet castled and White has every chance to develop a formidable attack on the enemy king. So Steinitz does not engage in pawn eating in the opening, but develops. He pins the enemy knight and thus puts indirect pressure on the d4 square and also protects the pawn located on the d4 square. White moved queen b3, they attack the weak point f7 as well as the pawn located on the square b7. But the first world champion finds a very powerful move to continue the bishop f3. It allows White to take f7 on the square with a check, freeing black from the possibility of castling in either direction. And after capturing f7 on the square, the black king retreats to f8. Now it was necessary for White to play gf to take the piece on the f3 square, and after the move knight f6, a very acute situation arises on the board. Despite the fact that the black king has lost the right to castle, black has good compensation for this in the form of a damaged pawn structure on the king's side and also the opportunity to play against the white king. Here it is not clear whose king will be weaker in the end, but apparently White thought that they could expose the position of the black king by capturing on g8, mate on f7 threatens. They have to take the rook on the g8 square, and after White has won back a piece on the f3 square, Wilhelm Steinitz makes a very cool move g5. He clears a path for the king on the h8 square, fixes White's weaknesses on the king's side, and after the king goes to h8, black will have a game against doubled and backward pawns that are located on the f-file, as well as in close proximity to the white king. Black will have the strongest attack. In the event that White tries to take the pawn on square b7 by attacking the knight, then the knight retreats to e5, counter-attacking the f3 pawn. If White defends this pawn, the c3 exchange follows and the continuation of rook b8 is an attack on the queen, and after the queen retreats, black begins to press on weaknesses and plays against weak pawn f3. They also have in reserve the maneuver of the king on the h8 square and the connection of the rook along the f-file to the attack on the king's side. Of course, black has an advantage here, so Steinitz's move g5 in the game Reiner played queen e6, bringing his queen closer to the king's side, but it turns out that here almost all squares are protected, except for square f5. Black here moved the knight e5 attacking the pawn f3, White gave check and a beautiful move king g7. The tactical rationale for the move is that if White tries to win a pawn on the g5 square and it seems that they are attacking the queen, but the fact is that the move is the bishop g5, the king retreats to h8 and it turns out that the enemy bishop is pinned. An attempt to protect this bishop with f4 runs into check. Well, after the retreat of the king, black wins a pawn on the g5 square with tempo and develops a powerful attack along the open lines f and g. In view of this, on the move of the king g7, Reiner played king h1. He also removes the king from the g-line. Now Steinitz withdraws his king to square h8. White responded with rook g1 pressing on the pawn g5, but now g4 is a powerful breakthrough. It turns out that to capture the pawn on square g4 the move will be queen h4 and black develops a terrible attack putting pressure on the f2 point, putting pressure on the pawn h2, threatening the move rook f8 with the introduction of the rook into the glutton row and with an attack on the enemy monarch. So on the move g4 White passes by and plays f4, but now the knight is introduced onto the square f3. White can win a pawn on the g4 square, which he does, but this leads to disaster. There was still some kind of struggle. Continuation rook g2, but even here after the move queen h4 black has a huge initiative. Rook f8 will then continue and attack the white king. Well, the move in the game rook g4 is of course weak. Now I propose to evaluate Steinitz's excellent positional sense in finding decisive moves that immediately lead to victory. So the move is queen h4, a great blow. Black creates the threat of mate on the h2 square, sacrifices the queen on the h4 square, but it turns out that if white takes the queen, then he gets mate on the g1 square. Therefore, Reiner responds with rook g2, but here the final powerful blow is queen h2. White has to take the queen on the h2 square, but this is rook g1 and this is checkmate to the white king. Such a beautiful game from the first world champion Wilhelm Steinitz.